Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture, and it's a big landmark for me. I've reached 30,000 subscribers. Thank you all for getting me to this point, and I want to do something special, not just my regular Q&A. How about a top 10 list? Shall we? But okay, I'm actually combining this with something that was coming up already on my schedule. But I gotta admit, when I first added the highest tier option to include requests for a top 10 list on my Patreon, I had no idea what was gonna be requested. Opening up the vast decades of Billboard history meant that this could go in any direction, and that could mean a wealth of new discoveries here. And thus, for our first Patreon quest, the top 10 best hit songs of 2010. Okay, here's why this feels a little bit uncanny to me. 2010 was arguably the year where I started having any desire to review music, which started off on Facebook before I took it to my blog 2 years later, and YouTube in 2013, and the rest is history. Thank you all for sticking around. And while you could argue that the birth of the pop music critic in video form came a year earlier, this was the year where real traction was starting to come through. And for a pop music critic, 2010 was a gold mine. At least on the surface, the Hot 100 was in the throes of the club boom, an avalanche of electro pop overflowing with garish color and personality at that club that really hasn't been seen since, and its collapse a few years later would ultimately diminish or destroy a lot of careers. But of course, under deeper investigation, there was more to it, as the chart could easily be split in two between the wildly hedonistic, often wildly stupid party that encompassed a lot of pop, R&B, hip-hop, and hints of the more dance-leaning rock scene. Remember, electronic music was not that big in the mainstream yet, and the rest of mainstream music, though, plugging their fingers in their ears and seemingly making the most sedate music possible. From the neutered adult alternative scene to country at its most placid. No bro country here. Now, what this all meant is that no matter what genre you were in, the Hot 100 was not looking to seriously engage or challenge you as the audience. And when you couple it with a lot of production that might have sounded futuristic then, but now sounds really painfully dated, there's a reason that's widely held as a pretty bad year overall for the Billboard Hot 100. But 7 years later, is that still the case? Well, I gotta be honest, yes and no. It's true that time has not been kind at all to the majority of this year-end list, both in songs and artists, but there are gems here, just not that many of them. And it's very questionable how many could stand out against years of true lasting classics that will stick around, like 2011 or 2015. But still, I managed to pull together a list from that year-end Billboard Hot 100, even managed to find some honorable mentions that we will get to before the end. Remember, the songs had to debut this year, keeping my regular rules. So let's get started off with number 10. So as I have said, this was a moment for some artists that they would never be able to recapture again in 2010. And while that was often most linked directly to the club boom, there were a few exceptions. And this is one of them.
Everything is opposite. I don't feel like stopping it. So baby, tell me what I got to lose. He's into me for everything I'm not.
I've already talked about Orianthi over on Beyond ARTV when I collaborated with John, and we went through a 7 on Sundays list of one-hit wonders who then disappeared. But I think the bigger miracle is that Orianthi had a hit at all. Let's be real, 2010 was a terrible year for mainstream rock on the Hot 100. Namely that the scant few songs that did cross over are not remembered at all by anybody, for good reason. And yet, seemingly out of nowhere, Orianthi blazed his success with one song that didn't match anything else, abandoning the tiresome trudge of post-grunge or the synth-heavy decline of pop rock for the pure hard rock shredding that Michael Jackson himself recognized and utilized for his album This Is Us before his untimely death a year earlier in 2009. Now, this is not exactly a sophisticated song, and it has faded on me a little bit in the past 7 years. Orianthi never carried a ton of unique presence behind the microphone, and the lyrics very nearly fell in the trap where she was defining her worth based upon her partner's opinion of her, but it made up for it in intensity and an actual guitar solo in a year where that was utterly foreign to the Hot 100. Really, it's the definition of a fluke breakout hit that the Hot 100 really hasn't produced in hard rock since, at least not that it's crossed over. And while Orianthi would fade into the background as a supporting guitarist in coming years, she still has one pretty kick-ass song to her name. Let's make sure we remember it. Number 9. So for as much as I've talked about the club boom already, there are artists that seem to exist outside of those larger trends. And to some extent, Alicia Keys is one of them. But in 2009, she released her 4th album, The Elements of Freedom. And unlike her more classically inclined soul of her previous show-stopping single No One from 2 years earlier, this was a more pronounced step into modern synth-driven R&B. And it's tough to evaluate whether or not that was a good thing. On the one hand, while the album sold like gangbusters, it was never a critical darling. And of the 2 singles that made the year-end list in 2010, neither of them broke the top 20 for her. But on the other hand, we did get this.
I'm gonna hold on to the times that we had tonight. I'm gonna find a way to make it without you.
So when people talk about Alicia Keys, they don't talk about this song, and I honestly have no idea why, because it's easily one of her more interesting and textured singles, especially around that time. Taking the heavier percussion courtesy of Jeff Basker that he would later popularize with Fun in 2012 and that had characterized much of her previous singles, she then cushioned it with a thick wellspring of synthesizers that, unlike so many of the tones of this era, they still sound fantastic and full. The perfect support for Alicia Keys using her breathy upper register to gorgeous effect with perfect multi-tracking. You also wish you would do more of that. And sure, you could make the argument that it was a bit of an odd tone to pair for lyrics that flip back and forth between still being very much in pain and taking the right steps forward, but there was no anger here, just an unearthly feeling of calm but vulnerable assurance, which always fits the maturity that Alicia Keys has brought to her best work. It's honestly a shame that she seemed to abandon this path on future albums, but as it is, this song, underappreciated gem. Definitely check it out. It deserves more attention. Number 8. So here's a prediction. When music critics make their top 10 lists of the best hit songs of 2017, Kesha's song Praying will make a majority of these lists. And yet if you had told many of those critics that back in 2010, they would have called you crazy, because if you were looking for the common poster child of the club boom, it was Kadala Sign Ha, who had 4 singles that year. And look, in 2010, I would have been among there with them. Kesha was obnoxious, her lyrics felt vapid, she abused autotune, and even if she was making a parody of pop music, it was hard to tell where the joke ended and reality began. But in late 2010, she released a single that would reflect a darker, rougher side of her persona, and the first sign of what was to come. And well,
Turn me on when I take it off, when I take it off, everybody take it off.
at the time, this song alienated a lot of people, critics included. But that's because it was designed to. Folks could get behind TikTok and Your Love Is My Drug because it played to their expectations. Vapid club culture and shallow psychedelia, that was easy. But Take It Off was a step into something rougher and harsher and nastier. The After Hours Club, where everything is filthy, everyone is wasted, and we're moments away from a fight or an orgy breaking out, possibly both. It's also where Kesha made it very obvious that she wasn't speaking for the pampered club princesses anymore, with water bottles full of whiskey, broken trash cans, and a harsher synth melody that taunted and teased a wild edge to come. This was music for outcasts and folks who had nowhere else to turn, just wanted to run wild. And that desperate edge translates through how the auto-tune contorts around Kesha's lower register, which I honestly wish she would use more of. Give that track an arrangement with guitars, this could easily be a punk song. But since this is 2010 and that was never gonna happen, except, you know, whenever Kesha performs the song live on tour, she had to smuggle it onto the radio another way. And you know what, I will be the first to admit this took years to grow on me properly, but with the benefit of hindsight and with history, this is the moment where Kesha's trajectory to lasting stardom became all the more apparent. Oh yeah, it's a kick-ass song regardless. Check it out. Number 7. Of all the songs that will make this list, I can imagine this will be the biggest surprise. And it makes sense why, given that this artist went on to make music that sounded nothing like this in the next 7 years. And at least to me, nothing with this quality. And you can definitely disagree with me on this, I know a bunch of you will, but I know that in 2017, Selena Gomez, for me, she's never topped this.
Everything comes naturally, it comes naturally when you're with me, baby. Everything comes naturally, it comes naturally, baby.
You know, I think I like Naturally for many of the same reasons I unironically like Miley Cyrus's early song See You Again. It's grounded in a real rock groove, it's got a massive hook that manages to conceal the artist's biggest flaws as singers, and the songwriting actually plays to their strengths. So where Miley was teenage exuberance, for Selena, Naturally is all tight and wiry, with a sharp fuzz of the beat keeping up that tempo quick as the busy percussion drives a lot of that groove. It's not a song that has a lot of room for error, but it needs to sound sleek, but also not, giving Selena just enough room to emote but not embarrass herself. And even then, the bridge that's kind of pushing it. And while long forgotten and sorely missed backing band The Scene is doing a lot of the heavy lifting on this, it's one of the few songs where Selena Gomez actually sounds like she's enjoying what she's doing. She sounds like she's having fun. And for this sort of dance pop song, that adds up to a lot. It's a track that plays into how easy it feels for her to be in love. And it's not hard to get sucked along for the ride. And if you compare this to anything else she's released in the past 7 years, it's hard not to wish that we could get get more of this. I kind of wish Selena Gomez would have more fun. Just saying. Number 6. I debated a lot whether or not I could put this song on this list, because for me personally, it's complicated, and not just for the fact that I remember attending a house party where two very drunk people were trying to reenact parts of the music video, and no, I'm not kidding about that. No, this is a song that became more interesting to discuss than actually appreciate, and I could only imagine the think pieces if either artist put it out today and not in 2010, and even then, it was controversial. And then I went back to listen to it, and, well...
Just gonna stand there and hear me cry. Well, that's alright, because I love the way you lie. I love the way you lie.
Love the Way You Lie will always have a complicated place in the history of both Eminem and Rihanna, mostly because there's no way to consider the song without the context of their own unique histories. For Eminem, you could tell it was at least some of the content was rooted in his disastrous on and off again relationship with Kim, and with Rihanna, it was 2010. And while Chris Brown's career had only just started to recover, the public had not forgotten the incident. So into all of it comes Love the Way You Lie, which shows both sides of a bitterly toxic and likely abusive relationship, and the controversy started in earnest, mostly due to framing that seemed a little bit more even-handed than many would have ever dared expect. Little did anybody know that it likely held far more truth for both Eminem and especially Rihanna down the road, as her complicated emotions around that incident would resonate into so much of her music for years to come. But what all tends to be forgotten is that Love the Way You Lie is an pretty impressive song all the same, nailing an incredibly difficult balancing act in the content and delivery off of one of the better beats off Recovery, a record that even now seems to have aged more badly than Relapse, and that's saying something. And there is a part of me that feels a song like this earns some points on audacity alone. And the fact that Rihanna and Eminem managed to stick the landing here and make something with genuine intensity in a year where nobody really wanted it, that says a lot. It's not either of their best work, I will say that, but 7 years on, I can respect this song. It's got a place in pop history, and it's a damn good song to boot. Number 5. I've said that there are oddities that stick out in the year-end Hot 100 of 2010, and we still have more of them to talk about on this list, but even despite the fact that this shouldn't surprise me this became a hit, it still kinda does. And you'll see why.
And I promise you, kid, that I'll give so much more than I get. I just haven't met you yet.
So remember when I said how pop was either trying to embrace the club scene or was desperately trying to pretend that it didn't exist? Well, what that meant is that adult alternative and easy listening radio started going into some weird places, like giving One Republic and wannabes like the script multiple hits, or nearly giving Train the biggest song of 2010 with Hey Soul Sister. But even with that context, putting the Canadian crooner Michael Buble on the radio must have felt far-fetched. It'd be like giving a crossover pop song to Josh Groban. While his audience is big, it doesn't really fit in with the context of the Hot 100. It just doesn't happen. And yet, I can't deny that I really do love this song regardless. Sure, it's jaunty and kind of middle-aged, and the brass section plays pretty broadly, but Michael Buble is a savvy enough performer to lean towards a younger demographic in his presentation and delivery, and with a lot of his production and content, where he has enough easy charm and natural charisma to make it feel both earnest and not cloying. And yeah, while part of this was timing on his part, the other half kind of was luck. If Justin Timberlake had not been having an off year and with no real male pop star to fill in effectively, Michael Buble was able to capitalize on it for a few short months before heading back to selling out concerts that your mom would love to attend. And you know what, hell, see him play stuff like this? I'm not sure I would mind going to the concerts either. This is a damn good song. Number 4. So here's the tough thing about doing these lists years after the fact. Context. Because like it or not, I'm 7 years removed from 2010, and I'm a very different person than I was in 2010, thank God. So if I were making this list then, I'd almost be positive that I would have different tastes because, well, my own tastes have evolved and shifted as I've grown up. And yet, when evaluating a list like this, you want to place individual songs within the context of their era, not based on the goodwill that you might develop for the artist years later. But at the same time, history is still relevant, and discussing these songs now without the benefit of the last 7 years in order to shape my gut opinion means I would be doing these tracks and artists a disservice. And outside of Kesha, I don't think there is a song or artist that has risen higher than this.
There you go, pulling me right back in, right back in, right back in, and I know I'm never letting this go. I'm stuck on you, whoa, whoa, stuck like glue. You and me, baby. baby, we're stuck like glue.
Okay, you might not get this now, but you have to understand back then. When Sugarland got big off of Stuck Like Glue, there was outrage, especially from the country community. What the hell was this? A gimmicky, cloying pop country tune that cranked up all the little garish elements to the group to cartoonish extremes, and then there was the video? And for a time, you know what, I was right there with them, branding it an annoying sellout tune in an era where country did not need to be picking up more polish in this vein. And the fact that it all felt so tongue-in-cheek was even more grating, and when you factor in Jennifer Nettles' voice, that was saying a lot. But it wasn't until last year when I reviewed Jennifer Nettles' excellent record Playing with Fire, which tilted straight into the same style of pop country, that I'd realized I've been lying to myself for so long. Yeah, the popping mouth noises and the accordion and the out-of-nowhere auto-tune and weird breakdown of the bridge and all the contortions that Jennifer Nettles put her voice through, they were kind of odd and they were a little cloying, but that was the point. And tapping into a ripe core of real sincere emotion that I found tremendously endearing. Yeah, it's also damn silly, but it's an infectious silliness that the song knows and owns without care. And I can get behind that, especially coming out of the past couple of years. What can I say? A song like this sticks with you. Number 3. So while there are songs that get better in my eyes with the context of history, on the flip side there are tracks that you need to get why they work at all, you need to understand the time in which they were made and came out. And in 2010, the chance that indie rock would cross over to the Hot 100 at all was seemingly a lost cause. Sure, you had quirky upstarts scattered across the previous decade, but the indie rock boom of the 2004-2005, that was thoroughly dead, and the pop rock scene in the mid to late 2000s was dying in slow motion. It wouldn't be until 2012 where things would actually recover, and yet, given that this band found a follow-up success in that year especially, it's kind of fitting that this song was the opening salvo. Let's get this out of the way right now. Habits by Neon Trees is an absolutely terrific indie rock debut that does not get nearly the credit it deserves. It's sleek, the grooves are sticky as hell, the new wave flourishes are tight and flavorful but bring in some real personality without indulgence, and the writing fit exactly the garish retro style the band was targeting. They got a lot of flack from the time at critics for maybe too nakedly appropriating the sounds of their other acts like The Killers, who the Neon Trees actually opened for, but it's not like The Killers were ever consistent on a full album, we all know that now, and hell, Neon Trees would never be this consistent again themselves. But in 2010, we get the lightning spark of Animal, and it was everything the rock-starved Hot 100 needed. Great groove, colorful lyric, a phenomenal explosion off that bridge, and Tyler Glenn proving he was one hell of a frontman. Nobody expected them to have another hit in this vein, but then they did. And then they faded, but you know what? I'm still taking whatever I can get because this song is fantastic. Number 2. I've come to discover that people have a weird relationship with singer-songwriters like this one, and probably not one that's fair to those singer-songwriters. Looked down upon to catering to middle-brow taste in writing and production by the indie set, but often considered a little bit too smart by the mainstream. They tend to get overlooked or dismissed by a lot of critics on both sides, often unfairly. And yeah, it's gotten a little bit better now in 2017, but I was there 7 years ago, and I remember the broad, sweeping dismissals of big chunks of the slowly dying adult alternative landscape. Or worse yet, the condescension. How so many knew exactly how those acts could either win their approval or win mainstream success, so it's a good thing that one of those artists knew exactly the right response, and boy oh boy, she delivered.
So you dare tell me who to be, who died and made you king of anything.
On the surface, it's easy to see King of Anything as an obvious follow-up to Sara Bareilles' smash hit Love Song in 2007. But frankly, I've always preferred this song. The instrumentation is more diverse with the brass, it doesn't feel the need to rely on rock elements that didn't really quite fit the first time around, let's be honest, and the critique was a lot more pointed and specific. Hell, it was arguably ahead of its time in calling out guys projecting their plans and ambitions for girls without really giving her a chance to say what she really wants, hitting mansplaining in the gut cut before that was even a word in the popular lexicon. And while the words definitely cut, Bareilles' framing is ingenious, empowering but not overplaying her hand, confident but showing real exhaustion and sadness that she has to go through this shit again and again with more guys. And I actually like how it does feel more polished, harsh enough to deliver some tough words to the guys who need to hear them, but none in a way where her exasperation is tempered effectively, which likely proved more effective in the long term with getting this message to actually stick with the audience, kind of smuggling it in there. Unsurprisingly, this still was barely a hit and only scraped onto the bottom of the year-end list. But for 2010, this was a welcome shot of cunning and real brains that both the adult alternative at the time and the year as a whole desperately needed. Definitely check this out if you haven't heard it. Underappreciated gem in the extreme. But before we get on to our final song on this list, the number one, how about a couple honorable mentions, shall we?
Can't sleep, let's run away and don't ever look back, don't ever look back.
I think critics were expecting this song to have more staying power than it did, but with Katy Perry's diminishing returns as an artist, especially in 2017, and the reputation of its primary architect, Dr. Luke, utterly destroyed, it doesn't quite have the same pathos as it once did. And again, it's hard not to feel like Glee's acapella cover eclipsed the original in some of the cultural zeitgeist, even of the time. But still, this was a damn good song all the same. I like a lot of it. Hey, it's not bad to go back to.
Break your heart. I'm only gonna break your heart. I'm only gonna break your heart. I'm only gonna break your heart.
Taio Cruz, a profoundly limited performer who had his only 2 hits in 2010, and while they're both pretty good, Break Your Heart was arguably the better one over Dynamite, with tighter writing, more charisma, breezier synth tones, and a Ludacris guest verse that didn't feel worthless in a year full of interchangeable Ludacris guest verses. For the electropop of the era, yeah sure, it's lightweight. It knows it, but you know what, for me, got the job done. I dig it.
Can we pretend that airplanes in the night sky like shooting stars? I can really use a wish right now, wish right now, wish right now.
Yeah.
You know, if this song had been packaged with Airplanes Part 2 with the Eminem verse, it would probably have made the list proper. But as it is, it's a glaring reminder of all that potential that B.o.B had that he would squander in spectacular fashion in the coming years. And yet, with a great piano line and a killer subtle hook from Hayley Williams, it's no surprise that people remember and mostly like Airplanes to this day, despite everything that B.o.B has said and done. But speaking about Hayley Williams,
You are the only exception. You are the only exception.
yeah, I know. I've said in the past I'm no big fan of Paramore, and I really, for the most part, I wasn't a big fan of this song. Again, this took a while to grow on me, but I think it was probably tainted a little bit by the underwhelming Glee cover that has happened. But going back to this now, while that guitar progression is always something that did feel uncannily like I'd hear in a Coldplay song, it's heartfelt and powerful ballad that Hayley Williams performs excellently. For Paramore, it's a great song, and I can admit that.
I better find your loving. I better find your heart. I better find your loving. I better find your heart. I better find, give all my love, and nothing's gonna tear us apart.
Hey, remember when Drake wasn't criminally overexposed? Or when Kanye actually took the time to assemble a layered and complex beat with real texture to it? And when Drake's R&B brooding actually felt like it carried some weight and complexity, especially when him as a writer? Okay, actually, if you go back to 2010, there was a lot more Drake than you would otherwise expect, and a lot of it really isn't very good. He was clearly still finding his sea legs that year. But with 7 years of hindsight and a half dozen permutations of Drake's sound, I just wish he'd focus more on stuff like this. He might show up on these lists a fair bit more often.
Everybody knows I got the magic in me. When I hit the floor, the girls come snapping at me. Now everybody wants a blast of magic, 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 magic.
Ugh. God damn it, B.o.B, you had so much potential. And yeah, this track is kind of goofy, and how the synth and vocals constantly have the feel of dropping out can get a little bit grating, and Rivers Cuomo is very clearly phoning it in. But in 2010, this sort of pop rap bounce was infectious and signaled real promise. To go back to that, You don't need magic, you just need a miracle.
Dance like it's the last night of your life. Life won't get you right. 'Cause baby tonight, the DJ guy's falling in love again.
This very nearly made my list. People tend to forget that Usher had a huge 2010 with multiple hits making that year-end list. Granted, they tend to forget that because most of those hits were pretty bad, especially OMG, but this was something kind of special. A razor-tight R&B dance floor jam where Usher was on his game and the groove was terrific. It was the best possible example of what the club boom could be, not named I Got a Feeling, and then Pitbull showed up. And while the majority of critics like me have gotten a lot kinder to Pitbull over the past 7 years for actually showcasing real likability and actually having some charm to him, in 2010, it definitely hadn't been refined to get to that point yet, and he really is the factor and weak link keeping this song off the list proper. Still, great moment for Usher, and considering how many acts are still trying to rip him off to this day, that's saying a lot. And finally, the moment you all been waiting for, number 1. So when I set out to make this list, I put forward the idea that the Hot 100 chart in 2010 was split between the club boom and all the songs that were pretending that it wasn't happening. But there was a middle ground. I think it's telling that the best hit song of 2010 actually captured both sides. And while the group has had momentum going into that, this was a song that put them over the top in the best way possible. The sort of crossover I don't think that anyone could have possibly predicted, but captured the zeitgeist of the time perfectly. And thus, it shouldn't surprise anybody that this is my pick for the number 1. Some years, the popular consensus aligns with critical acclaim, and in 2010, for Lady Antebellum, that happened.
It's a 1:15. I'm all alone and I need you now. Said I wouldn't call, but I lost all control and I need you now.
You know, putting aside the cultural moment that made this song such a tremendous hit, and a lot of people forget that because it swept its Grammy nominations, it's gone sextuple platinum, it's widely considered a country and adult alternative staple that, again, put Lady Antebellum on the map to this day. It's hard to say anything that hasn't already been said about this song, but the fact that Need You Now is so brutally effective at its primary purpose, the sort of regretful story told from both sides of a shattered relationship finding one more desperate drunken hookup where the history is implied and the pain is real. It lets Hillary Scott underplay, to her credit, wish she'd do that more often, and it lets Charles Kelly's older, rougher voice shoulder a lot of the weight of this song, and it carries the acknowledgement that something underpinned all the reckless hedonism of the time, a desire to find any connection in a shallow era, even if this is the one that hurt the most, because you'd rather have that than nothing at all. The production is gorgeous and perfectly melancholic in that lingering minor piano chord. The solo cuts in at precisely the right moment and ends with enough resolution to continue forward, but not enough that it actually defines what that might be. And even back in 2010, in one of the worst years of my own life, I still had a place for this song. And where I have to wonder if 6 years later, where I would put Charles Kelly twice on my list of my best songs of 2016, not just the hits, if Need You Now had at least partially paved the way. But in the end, it might not be the surprising pick, but it's the right one. Need You Now, the best hit song of 2010. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Guys, I have to thank you all again. 30,000 subscribers. Again, I never thought I would get this far, and I really appreciate for all you guys who are on here, and especially those folks on Patreon who are helping support this channel and help carve out my schedule. I really appreciate all you guys sticking around. Let's go for another 30,000. Let's hope it takes a little bit less than 4 years to get there, though. But until then, I'm Mark. Thanks a lot for watching, because you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.